We heard it, and because I was just like standing there pretty much looking out the window, I didn't see what caused it or if there was an impact.
So you have no idea right now?
There's another one. Another plane just hit. Right. Oh my God, another plane.
But there was a cascade of sparks and fire, and now it looks almost like a mushroom cloud explosion, this huge billowing smoke in the second tower. This was the second of the two towers hit. And I cannot see behind that smoke, obviously, as you can either. The first tower in front has not changed.
When we talk about the war in Afghanistan, it's kind of easy to forget exactly why it started. Looking back at the footage of what happened on that sunny Tuesday morning, I don't know if anyone can truthfully say that they wouldn't have made the same decision without hindsight.
Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them.
Now, of course, the war was an unmitigated disaster, and 20 years later, Afghanistan is still under threat from the same Taliban forces that we went in to remove, and progress towards democracy and women's rights all seem lost. The war was initially very different from the one in Iraq, where the international community saw what had happened in America. They saw the kind of people that the Taliban were harbouring, and they decided to get on side. And what's more, the war was initially very successful, with the Taliban government toppled, them seemingly defeated. So how did it all go so wrong? 9/11, as we all know, was done by Al-Qaeda, a terrorist organisation run by Osama bin Laden, the son of a Saudi Arabian oil magnate. So how did the action of a Saudi Arabian cause a war more than 1,000 miles away? Well, Al-Qaeda was really controversial in the Middle East, and they'd been kicked out of Saudi Arabia, moved to Sudan, where they were kicked out of there as well, and they were eventually given shelter in Afghanistan by the Taliban government. The Taliban are not considered to be a terrorist organisation, but when they were in government, they were something of a pariah state. Now, the Taliban were a splinter group from the Mujahideen, who were a group of Islamic insurgents who fought against the Soviet-backed republic in the 1980s and 90s. The Taliban were the most extreme of this group, believing in a strict form of Sharia law, which included things like banning girls from going to school. The Taliban, which is Pashto for students, mostly came from the madras or religious schools around Afghanistan. According to Nasrin Akhtar, the leading clergy or ulema of Afghanistan were part of the resistance movement against the communists and were at the forefront of mobilizing support for the war and recruiting young fighters for their madrasa. Continuing on, they write that the Taliban of these madras grew up and socialized in a purely conservative religious environment. Their world outlook, ideology, attitude towards other religions, other sects of Islam, views about the West, and political culture were shaped at a very impressionable age. Because the Pashtun really valued the ulema, these schools really influenced the thinking of a lot of Pashtun people. The Taliban took the fight to the Mujahideen. They were partially funded by Pakistan, who worried that the Mujahideen were too close to India. By 1996, the Taliban set up a government in Kabul, but they were only recognised by Pakistan, the UAE, Turkmenistan and Saudi Arabia. In the same year, Al-Qaeda started to take shelter in Afghanistan, and after 9/11, the Taliban refused to hand bin Laden over, and so the US invaded. Between October and December 2001, a series of rapid battles took place between the Taliban and a US-led coalition and Northern Alliance. This started with air raids, and then on the 9th of November, the coalition won the city of Mazar-e-Sharif. The coalition bombed the southern entrance of the city, and then General Dostum of the Northern Alliance captured Keshendeh in the southwest with horse-mounted troops because he's a mad lad. General Norden captured Ag-Kapruk in the south, and then both started to advance, forcing the Taliban and Al-Qaeda to retreat. This was a bit of a shock to the coalition, but the fighting portion of the war would go much like this. On the 12th of November, the US bombed airfields in Herat. Then Iranians infiltrated the city and incurred an insurrection. On the 13th of November, the capital of Kabul fell to the coalition and Northern Alliance forces, and 54,000 Taliban and Al-Qaeda militants retreated to Kandahar and Tora Bora. Then, between the 22nd of November and the 9th of December, the guerrilla fighters under the future president Hamid Karzai, with the help of US airstrikes, got the enemy in Kandahar to surrender before the coalition had even arrived. The only place left was the Tora Bora cave complex on the Pakistani border. This is where the war started to fall apart, because there were a lot of Taliban and Al-Qaeda leaders, including Osama bin Laden, at Tora Bora, and yet the US let them get away. So if they knew he was there, then why didn't they capture him? Well, Lowry blames the US strategy. She writes that Franks and Rumsfeld decided to attempt to deliver a swift and economical blow to the Taliban through air power and a limited application of troops on the ground. Instead of employing the POW doctrine of overwhelming force, they depended on highly mobile paramilitary teams working in concert with opposition warlords and tribal leaders. Franks capped the number of boots on the ground at 10,000. For this reason, the relative scarcity of US soldiers, Franks and Rumsfeld refused to send more troops to Tora Bora to block, capture or kill bin Laden. As such, bin Laden escaped into Pakistan, which really took the wind out of the US victory, and this may well have contributed to the war in Iraq, but I'll get to that in a minute. After the war, the UN hosted the Bonn Conference, a meeting between several Afghan leaders but excluding the Taliban, which would decide on a new Afghan constitution, which included the presidency of the guerrilla fighter Hamid Karzai. So you've probably heard that a reconstruction of Afghanistan is where it really went wrong, and President Karzai is kind of like a microcosm of this problem. For example, in an essay by Kafir, he writes that Karzai won support from the international community because he came from an important family, he was a southern Afghan Pashtun, he had fought the Taliban, he was well educated and spoke English, which made it easy for him to communicate with international leaders. Basically, Karzai became president because the West wanted him to become president, and this was a problem which absolutely plagued the entirety of Reconstruction. For example, continuing on with the same essay, it says, when looking at the formation of the interim administration, it exhibited what the international community wanted to see in respect to Afghanistan rather than reflecting the realities in Afghanistan. Another example of this is in the implementation of things like women's rights, which obviously the vast majority of people watching this would agree is a very, very good idea. However, it might not have been in Afghanistan because you did have big swathes of the society who were very conservative, so you're taking something that by default these people are naturally inclined to disagree with, and you're implementing it via a foreign power, making it a colonialist exercise. According to Rogers, a lot of these oversights can be blamed on Bush's foreign policy philosophy. For example, he writes that Bush was influenced by a neoconservative outlook, which saw the United States as having a historic role in leading the world to an era of peace and stability, focused on economic neoliberalism and democracy. Bush's intentions were to create a democratic, anti-terrorist state in Afghanistan, and therefore, they were pretty good intentions, but unfortunately they also weren't realistic. What's more, the transition to democracy was chaotic and violent, and the government it installed was absolutely corrupt. In 2004, there was an absolute crisis. The Guardian reported that voters in several areas complained that ink used by election officials to stain people's fingers to prevent multiple voting was easily rubbed off. By 2004, the Taliban had resurfaced as well, and they killed about 12 people throughout the campaign using funding and propaganda, which I explain in my other video on the subject. So why wasn't the US focused on rooting them out? Here's where I'll briefly talk about Iraq, a controversial war for many reasons and one which took resources away from Afghanistan. In a Daniel Lieberfeld article on theories of conflict in the Iraq War, he writes that one possible reason that the US got involved in the conflict was in an effort to enhance US reputational and symbolic power beyond challenge, particularly after the September 11th, 2001 attacks that might have made the US appear vulnerable. The reason that this makes sense in the context of Afghanistan is it was meant to be a quick, easy and just war, but as Al Jazeera columnist Ashani Burke quite scathingly puts it, rather than the good war moniker that the Afghanistan conflict has been cloaked with since its inception, it was ironically the not good enough war. Of course, Iraq was also more complicated than intended. Ashani Burke goes on to write that until roughly 2005, Iraq took attention away from Afghanistan. After that point, it began to take resources too. Some officials said that the Bush administration's attention would break down maybe about 85% on Iraq and 15% on Afghanistan, or maybe even 90% attention on Iraq and 10% on Afghanistan. British soldiers were reportedly told that NATO would have to take the lead in the war because the Americans were just too busy. And with a resurgent Taliban, deaths started to rise and the war seemed unwinnable, so Obama pushed for a new strategy to train Afghan troops to deal with the Taliban themselves and focused US strategy on the killing of bin Laden, which he achieved. With bin Laden's death, the war started to wind down, and in 2012 the US and the Taliban held peace talks which fell apart when the US insisted on them talking to the central government in Kabul. In 2014, the NATO mission in Afghanistan went from an active combat one to one which was basically focused just on assisting and training the Afghan security forces, and Obama tried to use this as a pretext for a total withdrawal of troops by 2016, but escalating violence led him to change his mind. Donald Trump's policy got a lot of flack for being, kind of inconsistent.
Afghanistan is a total and complete disaster. What are we doing?
But he said, I didn't want to go to Afghanistan. It's not right. No, Afghanistan is where we should have gone.
And then it changed to just fully militant.
We are not nation building again. We are killing terrorists.
However, after a troop surge which didn't yield any positive results, Donald Trump changed his mind again and met with the Taliban in Doha, where they made a peace agreement, and this peace agreement is being carried on by President Joe Biden, and all US troops will leave Afghanistan by September 11th, 2021 at the absolute latest. And with this, it kind of looks like the Taliban is going to retake control, because while the Afghan security forces have 350,000 soldiers at their disposal, according to The Guardian, they're still ill-equipped, particularly when it comes to air support and intelligence gathering. Now, when NATO was in Afghanistan, even in their non-combat role, they would occasionally lend air support, but unfortunately the Afghan security forces will not even have access to this anymore. After 20 years in Afghanistan, the story goes much the same as the rest of the war on terror. Mission accomplished fell apart as soon as rebuilding began, and many worry that progress made with the expenditure of a lot of NATO blood and treasure will soon be wasted. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you've made it this far, then I assume this content is your cup of tea, because, you know, you've made it all the way to the end, so you may as well give me a subscribe and a like and all of that. And also check out my weekly column on We Are Rightists, where I write mostly about British politics, but about a few other things as well.